The first story I have for you tonight is going to be the story of... I'm trying to get this in the right order. This is a story that happened on the way home. So imagine the Lewis and Clark expedition. Raise your hand if you know a little tiny bit already about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Just anything at all about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Okay, so the Lewis and Clark expedition happened about 200 years ago. And essentially it was 30 guys and one woman and a dog who went across the country and back on orders of President Jefferson. So just for those who aren't familiar. And so they went from, say, Ohio River area out to Cape Disappointment and back. And so our first story happens on the way back. Most of the expedition is done. They're almost home. And on the way back, Lewis and Clark decided to split up. Clark took half of the guys south along the Yellowstone River because they had never explored the Yellowstone River on the way out, so they wanted to check it out. Lewis took the other half of the guys north. They were going to go on the Missouri and the Marias River. The Marias River was important because it was the northernmost river they had found that went north. And they knew that whatever was around the Marias River was part of the Louisiana Purchase, part of the newly acquired lands of the United States. So Lewis wanted to see just how far north the Louisiana Purchase went, so he did a little side excursion up the Marias River. Now the Marias River was the territory of the Blackfoot Indians, right up there on the Canadian border. They had lived there for about 10,000 years. For 10,000 years, the Blackfoot Indians lived up on the Marias River. And during that time, they earned themselves a reputation for being fierce defenders of their homeland. But luckily, Lewis knew this. He had been warned by Thomas Jefferson, who told him, "You must go into the territory of the Blackfoot Indians and see how far north the Louisiana Purchase goes. I need a map of their territory. So you need to sneak through their lands, get me a map, and get home without getting caught." So Lewis and about 15 of these, they were basically army guys, were sneaking through Blackfoot territory, trying to make a map and not get noticed by these Indians who did not want people in their homelands. And this was a dangerous part of the expedition. Lewis made special rules, including one about hunting and about staying together. And he said everybody should always stay together unless you're out hunting. And we should stay as one big group all day until dinner time, when two people will go out hunting. They'll get dinner and come back. And this was such a dangerous job that they split up the duty. They made a list of everybody, and each night the top two people on the list would be chosen to go hunting. So tonight you guys are going hunting, tomorrow night you guys are going hunting, next night you're going hunting with whoever that lady is, and so on. Now on the night where the story takes place, it was Lewis and Pierre Cruzet who were chosen to go hunting. Has anybody ever heard of Pierre Cruzet? We've got a smile in the back. What, you know anything about him that you can remember?
This is going to get real interesting.
He's a kind of a comic character in some ways in the journals. He's always he's very described as being kind of a jolly guy. He plays the fiddle. He's kind of like a life of the party kind of guy. But he's also very unusual because most of the people on the expedition were young American men who had been in the army before. So it was like Lewis and Clark and like 29 young American men, and then there was Cruzet, Sacagawea, and a couple other people who didn't really fit the mold, right? So Cruzet was never been in the army before. He was a fur trapper on the upper Missouri River. He wasn't even technically American. I mean, he was living in what is now North Dakota, but he was not really born as an American. I like to think of him as Canadian. He was of mixed ancestry. He spoke, they reckon he spoke about 5 different languages, but English was not one of them. Okay, so he's the only dude on the Lewis and Clark expedition who didn't speak English. And he had just one eye. So he was like the one-eyed party animal of the Lewis and Clark expedition who came from Canada to be a geography expert. That was his expertise, the thing that got him hired, not his hunting skill. And so he and Lewis each grabbed 2 identical rifles. They all shared a group of about 25 rifles. They had some other guns along too, but they had these 25 matching rifles that Lewis had made specifically for the expedition. These were sort of like compact sniper rifle prototypes that Lewis had made back at Harper's Ferry. And the thing I want you to remember about these small sniper rifles is their bullet. They had a type of bullet or a size of bullet that had never been tried before. It was a 54 caliber round ball. And most guns at the time were 50 caliber. This was the first time in America that anybody had ever tried a 54 caliber in a rifle. So they were kind of unique prototype sniper rifles. Lewis grabbed one, Cruzette grabbed one. They headed off into Blackfoot territory, hoping to get some deer or elk and get back safely. They started sneaking through the woods, and Lewis was sneaking faster. He got up ahead of Cruzette, and before long they could both see that there were animals ahead of them in the distance. It was very thick with vegetation, sort of like what you see right here, where, you know, if there was a herd of elk 50 yards out there, you might be able to catch little glimpses of them. You could hear them, but you wouldn't see a whole elk at once. You just see little pieces and parts as they pass through the thick bushes. And that's basically what was happening. They were seeing some elk up in the distance, and they were looking for where they could get a shot. And at one point, Cruzette could see about 50 yards ahead of him that there was a patch of elk skin standing perfectly still, exposed between 2 tree trunks. So he raised his rifle to his one good eye and aimed it as best he could, pulled the trigger, and boom! The gun went off. It was a direct hit. Meanwhile, 50 yards in front of him was Lewis. Lewis was also looking at elk through the trees. And he could also see where an elk had paused in a clearing, and he had a good shot at it. So he raised his rifle and he prepared to fire. But before he could pull the trigger, he heard a loud boom from behind him, followed by pain in his butt. And he looked back to realize that he had one of the weirdest wounds in all of American history. Are you in 4th grade? That he had one of the weirdest wounds in all of American history, because that bullet had entered his right butt cheek, just below the belt line. It passed all the way through the right buttock, making a brief appearance in the middle before entering the left buttock and cutting its way through the left buttock and becoming lodged in his pants on the other side, for a total of at least 4 holes in Lewis's butt. And although he was seriously hurt, his next thought was for Pierre Cruzette, his teammate and friend. He said, "Pierre, are you back there?" And although Cruzette was just 50 feet away with a smoking gun in his hand, he said nothing. He hid in the bushes. Lewis's mind was racing. He was trying to figure out what happened. And his mind took him back to President Jefferson. He heard Jefferson's words about the Blackfoot, that they are fierce defenders of their homeland, that they are known to attack without warning, and that they take prisoners without mercy. Lewis decided that the Blackfoot had obviously shot him in the butt and captured Cruzette. He had to warn everybody. So he held his rifle under one arm, grabbed a butt cheek in each hand, and ran back to camp as fast as he could, where he told the guys assembled there, Look at my butt. It was the Indians, and they've got Cruzette. He said, grab your rifles and follow me back out there. So they all grabbed a sniper rifle off the pile and they headed back off into the bushes trying to find the Blackfoot attackers. They searched high and low, and during the search, Lewis was losing blood. He grabbed the shoulder of the nearest captain, happened to be Captain Patrick Gass, and he said, Gass, take me back to camp and help me with my butt wound. And so Patrick Gass and Lewis stagger back towards camp while everyone keeps looking for the Indians, the Blackfoot. Back at camp, it's all Lewis can do to grab onto the edge of a boat and bend over. And he tells Patrick Gass to please take off his trousers and have a close look at his butt wound. So Patrick Gass gets down on one knee and he starts to undo Lewis's pants. Meanwhile, out in the woods, they're all looking for the Blackfoot, but the only person they can find out there is Cruzette. Cruzette denies the entire thing, and they all go back to check on the captain. It just so happens that they arrive back at camp at the exact moment that Patrick Gass pulls off Lewis's pants. Whoosh! And as he does so, out drops the bullet. And when that bullet hit the ground, they all looked at it, and they looked at Lewis, and they looked at it, and they looked at Cruzette, and they looked at it, and they knew just by looking what size it was. What size was that bullet? 54 caliber. This was not a bullet of the Blackfoot Indians. This was a genuine Lewis and Clark bullet. So imagine that you are Cruzette. Imagine that you got hired as the geography expert on the most elite collection of military mines ever assembled in the United States. Imagine that you have made it all the way across the country and back with no English and one eye, and when you're about 2 weeks from home, you killed the boss. Or it looks like you killed the boss. He's bleeding out in front of everybody, and perhaps the last thing he can do with his last gasp is to decide what your punishment is. You might think that Lewis would have punished Cruzette severely, but he didn't. Cruzette was forgiven because Lewis realized that Cruzette was on his team, that Cruzette was a team player, that Cruzette was necessary part of the expedition despite being a mistake maker. It was one of many examples where Lewis did things like this. He did have a more stern side and a military-minded punishment dealer kind of person, and I think to some extent all good leaders have that in them, but Lewis had also a very healthy dose of what I call soccer mom mentality. He knew that he just had to get the kids to soccer practice, right? Or he knew he just had to get 33 people back to St. Louis safely. So Cruzette was part of that. Cruzette was an important part of getting home safely, as well as everything he had done up to that point. Now, Lewis was a very good leader, but he was not immune to making mistakes. So my last story for you tonight is Lewis's big mistake happened near a big waterfall. So we're gonna rewind the expedition to the very beginning. Imagine Lewis and Clark and the 31 other people are paddling their dugout canoes up the Missouri River. They've been doing this for only about a year now. When they come across a whole bunch of waterfalls blocking their path. It's called the Great Falls of the Missouri. And it was obvious that they could not go up the waterfalls. They'd have to drag everything around the waterfalls. Lewis wanted to make it as easy as possible, so he said, hey, why don't you guys wait here for a few days, start making wheels for the canoes, and I'm going to go walk up the right-hand side of the waterfall, and I'll measure it. how far it was. Then I'll walk back down on the left-hand side of the waterfall, and whichever way was shorter, we'll all just go that way. So he gave him 3 days to make some wheels while he was going to go check out the best way to get around the Great Falls of the Missouri. So he heads up, he grabs his walking stick, his backpack, and he heads up towards the top of the Great Falls of the Missouri. And along the way, he's doing all kinds of measurements, as he always does. He's not just measuring distance, but he's measuring elevation, and he's drawing pictures of plants, and maybe taking some notes about the weather, temperature, things like that. And he gets up to the top of the waterfall, and as he crosses the river, he measures how wide it is, he measures how deep it is, how fast it's flowing. And he gets over to the other side, and it's dinner time. So he looks around for something to eat. And in this part of the story, they are in the Great Plains, where it's just like big grassy fields, almost like football fields all around him. And he could see off in the distance, about 3 football fields away, about 300 yards away, he could see a herd of buffalo. And he figures, well, if he could just shoot one of these buffalo, that he could eat his fill, and there'd be tons of leftovers to eat during this portage, this dragging of the gear around the waterfall, which he estimated would take a few weeks of work. So he's like, yeah, I could shoot a few days worth of food at once. I'll eat some. Be a good idea. The only problem was that this buffalo was far away. It's like 300 yards by Lewis's estimation. And 300 yards is a long shot with a modern rifle. Okay? With this prototype sniper rifle and the round 54 caliber ammunition, this is a really, really long shot. But Lewis was pretty good with guns. He had been in the National Guard, in the regular Army, and in Special Forces. They had Special Forces back then. His was called the Chosen Rifles. They were a sniper's brigade. And during the time Lewis joined the Chosen Rifles, it was Clark who was the teacher. Clark taught Lewis how to be a sniper in Special Forces. Totally real. And Clark taught Lewis that the sniper needs 4 main tools. 1, you're going to need a sniper rifle. 2, you need a bullet. 3, gunpowder. 4, take this special walking stick. It's called an S-pontoon, Clark said. S-pontoon is a sniper's best friend because your rifle is so heavy. An 1803 sniper rifle weighs 9 pounds. That's like a gallon of milk with a can of Coke resting on top of it. Imagine holding a gallon of milk with a can of Coke resting on top of it at arm's length while you aimed it at a target 300 yards distant, and waiting approximately 1 minute while your aim settled down. Do you think you could hold a gallon of milk at arm's length for a full minute and have it rock solid? Probably not. Unless you could rest that on top of something. So they had these special walking sticks that were just long enough so that when you're standing up, you could rest your rifle on top of it and you could aim forever. So Lewis had these tools. He rested the S-pontoon on the ground. He laid the rifle across the top of it. He took a slow and careful aim at the buffalo, and he pulled the trigger. Boom! The gun went off. It was a direct hit. The buffalo fell over and died peacefully. Lewis walked over there making a terrible mistake. When he got up to that buffalo, he grabbed a knife from his sheath, and he got down on one knee, and he started to cut one juicy steak from the back of that buffalo. But he should have cut 2 steaks because he had company. America's largest carnivore was coming to dinner. And what's the biggest meat-eating animal in America in 1803? Grizzly bear. Grizzly bear was walking straight towards Lewis, looking at the buffalo. Stuff was dripping out of his mouth. The sight of this grizzly bear caused Lewis to have a flashback when he remembered the terrible time when he had seen his first grizzly bear. So I want to take you back to that time. When Lewis saw his first grizzly bear, he wasn't alone. He was walking on a trail with 6 of his best army buddies. All the top hunters in the group and Lewis were walking through the woods when they saw something on the trail ahead of them that turned out to be a sleeping grizzly bear. Lewis was curious, a little nervous, and he mostly wanted to do science on this thing. This was a species which had not been described in the eastern United States, in the United States. It was unknown in the actual United States. So Lewis was like, well, if I could do some science on this thing, Jefferson would, give me some extra credit. And so in order to do science on a grizzly bear in 1803, what's your first step?
Kill it.
You need to kill it, unfortunately. So Lewis, being the military commander that he was, turned to the closest private and he said, Private Reuben Field, he said, you see that grizzly bear over there? He said, I think it's asleep. I think you should sneak up to it and shoot it for science. And so Reuben Field was like, okay. And he grabbed his rifle and he snuck up to the grizzly bear. He got as close as he could to it, and then he shot a hole right through it. A grizzly bear woke up in a terrible mood and chased Private Field past Lewis and the other men at about 30 miles an hour. Lewis saw what happened and he just screamed, run! So they all ran behind Private Field, and one by one Lewis would call out their names. He would say, Private Smith, turn and fire! And Private Smith would be like, boom! And then they'd run a little further and they'd be like, Private Jones, turn and fire! Private Jones would be like, boom! And one by one, he called out all their names. They all shot their guns. They all appeared to be hitting the bear, and the bear just kept coming. It was only when the very last guy with the very last bullet managed to hit the bear in the head that it finally died peacefully. Lewis did some science on it. They made clothes out of its fur, and they ate nearly the entire thing. And on that day, Lewis had learned how not to kill a grizzly bear. So fast forward to the time by the waterfall, Lewis is all alone now. He just shot the buffalo. The grizzly bear's walking towards him. He has his flashback. He's like, man, I gotta make a headshot on this thing on the first try. So he rests his S-pontoon on the ground, puts the rifle across the top of it, and he takes a slow and careful aim at the grizzly bear's head. And then he waits as that grizzly bear gets closer and closer. And when that bear is so close he could not possibly miss, he squeezes the trigger. Click! When he heard the click instead of the boom, he realized what his mistake was. What was it? Didn't reload. No bullets in the gun. So there he stands with an empty gun and a walking stick. He backs away from the buffalo, and the bear charges at top speed. And at top speed, they say a grizzly bear can outrun a horse. Apparently, so can Lewis. Because he beat the bear in a race to the river, and on the way over, he formulated a whole new plan. This was a plan based on science. He knew from recent measurements that the Missouri River in this spot was 5.5 feet deep. He knew that he himself was 6 feet tall. He knew that a grizzly bear, when measured across its back, was about 5 feet at the most. So he figured if he could get into the middle of the river, he could stand up. The bear would be forced to swim. And he had just estimated the river current at being way more than a bear could do. So he figured he gets into the river, the bear is going to be swept over the waterfall, smashed on the rocks below, dinner time, everything will be fine. So he dives into the river, he wades out until... But then he learned something new about grizzly bears. They can stand on their hind feet. And on its hind feet, a grizzly bear, as it turns out, is 10 feet tall. This thing is looking down at Lewis, getting ready to tear his head off. Lewis had no time to reload. He had no friends to help him, and it looked like he might die. Then at the very last moment, he thought of a new plan. This plan was based on an unconventional weapon and self-confidence. He summoned up his courage and he convinced himself that he could kill the bear with a walking stick. So then he grabbed the S-pontoon like a baseball bat and he tried to convince the bear. He ran at it screaming, "Roar!" But he never got a chance to make contact with the bear because the bear believed in Lewis. The bear turned around 180 degrees and he ran off to the horizon, was never seen again. After he changed his pants, Lewis loaded his gun, and he never made that mistake again. So I hope that you see that Lewis was a mistake maker who also made history. That Cruzette was obviously a mistake maker, and even though he was an American, he wrote American history. So whether you're from Yakima or Bellingham or Vancouver, Washington, Texas, or Wenatchee, you are currently writing American history. So I hope that when you wake up tomorrow you realize you have a lot in common with Lewis and Clark, and I hope that tomorrow night you'll meet Dave here for a birding program at 7 o'clock. Thanks very much.
Thank you.